The classroom on Station Calvara had 31 seats and 31 students, and every single one of them had a threat assessment instinct their ancestors had paid for in blood. Valthara sat in the 4th row, centre left, the same seat she had chosen every semester since her first year at the Interspecies Academy, close enough to the front to hear Professor Daxar clearly, far enough from the door that no large predator could reach her before she had time to react. She had a system. She always had a system. The new student walked in on the 3rd day of orientation week, and Valthara's system immediately told her something was wrong. Not wrong like danger. She knew danger, her. People had been cataloguing it for 4 centuries, building entire libraries of it, teaching their young to recognize the particular stillness that came before a strike, but wrong like a data entry that did not match the expected field. She noted his height first, 1 meter 83 centimeters, tallish for his species but unremarkable by any standard that mattered in a room that already contained a Druvian twice his mass and a Kethael biology assistant in the corner. She noted his weight, approximately 82 kilograms, light, by any serious predator metric. She noted his limb count, 4, the bilateral symmetry his species shared with 11 other known intelligent races, none of which had ever ranked above Tier 4 on the Galactic Threat Index. These were the numbers. The numbers said, manageable. Her nervous system said something else entirely, and her nervous system had been refined by 400 years of surviving things that wanted to eat her ancestors, so she trusted it more than she trusted numbers. The human, Marcus Hale, according to the enrollment board at the front, walked to the back row and sat down without looking at anyone. That was the first thing. Most new students looked around. It was a biological reflex common to 73% of known species, the new environment scan, the rapid checking of exits and distances that Valthara herself performed every single time she entered a room she had not been in before. Marcus Hale did not do the new environment scan. He sat down the way someone sits in their own kitchen, like the room had already been assessed and found acceptable and now he was simply done thinking about it. Valthara opened her datapad and started a new file. Classification pending. Her species had never used that category for something that was not actively trying to kill them. Professor Daxar began the standard orientation lecture, academy rules, lab safety protocols, the interaction guidelines that existed because putting 43 different species in close proximity without structure tended to produce incidents that required a great deal of paperwork. Valthara had heard this lecture 3 times. She was not listening to the lecture. She was watching Marcus Hale's hands. The fingers were long and the nails were flat, keratin-based, blunt-edged, no hook, no point, no functional sharpness of any kind. Every species she knew that had hands structured like that was prey. She wrote in her datapad, vestigial claw sheaths, flat, no functional edge. Then she wrote it again. Then she noticed she had written it 4 times across the last 6 minutes and had retained nothing from the professor's safety guidelines. This was unprecedented. Valthara's note-taking had never failed her before. Not during the 3rd-year Predator Behavior Seminar where a live Vreth had been brought in and half the class had gone nonverbal. Not even during the incident last spring that she did not think about. She forced her attention to the front of the room. Marcus shifted in his seat, not fidgeting, just a single small adjustment, the kind that said he had been sitting completely still for a while and had made a minor mechanical decision to change that, and then his gaze moved across the room in a slow, deliberate arc. It was not the new environment scan. She knew the new environment scan. This was something older than that, quieter, more complete, the kind of looking that did not announce itself, that was already finished before you noticed it had started. The arc reached her section of the room. Valthara had been looked at by predators before, the flat, declarative eye contact of something that had already decided what you were, and this was not exactly that, but it was not the opposite of that either, and the difference was making her secondary respiratory sac tighten in a way she found deeply inconvenient given that she was supposed to be taking notes. His eyes found her. Not for long, 1 second, perhaps less, but directly, without any of the social softening that most species use to make eye contact feel less like a declaration. "You doing okay?" he said. His voice was flat, not cold, just flat, the way packed earth is flat, the way something with real weight behind it sounds when it has no particular interest in making a performance of itself. Valthara had 14 prepared social responses for cross-species first contact in academic environments. She produced 0 of them. Her mandibles sealed shut. Marcus held the look for another half-second, then turned back to his datapad, not rudely, just the way someone checks that a latch is closed before walking away from it, and that was the end of the interaction. Velthara remained very still. She was aware that she was still very still. She was aware that being very still was a species primary threat response, and that it had activated for a creature that had just asked her a polite question, and that this was information she did not entirely know what to do with. She looked at her datapad. Classification pending. She had spent 3 years at this academy studying predator biology, the mechanics of ambush, the neurological architecture of creatures that other creatures had nightmares about, and she had a very specific, very carefully built internal model of what dangerous looked like from the outside. Marcus Hale did not look dangerous. He looked like someone who had never needed to. Her people had a word for that, old word, pre-academy, pre-contact, from the centuries. When her species hid in crevices and prayed to whatever listened, the word translated roughly as, the thing that does not need to announce itself because it has never been questioned. She wrote it in the margin of her datapad in her native script. Then wrote, underneath it, see also, fingernails. Then wrote, vestigial, flat, blunt, no functional edge. For the 5th time. She closed the file and spent the rest of the lecture watching the back of his head, where Marcus Hale sat completely still in a room full of species who could not stop glancing at doors, shifting in their seats, doing the 1,000 small nervous things that living things do when they are surrounded by the unfamiliar. He did none of it. He just sat there, like the room had already been evaluated, and found unworthy of his concern. Xenobiology 301 was, by most academic measures, the hardest course offered in the Academy's Life Sciences department, not because the material was complex, though it was, but because the course had a live component. Professor Daxai had made this clear on the first day. He had said it the way experienced professors say things they enjoy watching new students process, calmly, with the particular patience of someone who has watched the same reaction happen 31 times over many years and still finds it worth observing. He had said, "You will not study predator behavior from a distance in this course." The room had gone quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when everyone in them is privately recalculating their academic choices. Velthara had not recalculated. She had simply added a new column to her existing risk assessment spreadsheet and gone on with her morning. The transport crate arrived on a Wednesday. 2 lab assistants wheeled it through the side door of the classroom and positioned it at the front, next to the lecture board, and the room's entire social geometry rearranged itself in the span of 4 seconds. Chairs scraped back, bodies pressed toward walls, the collective nervous system of 31 different species running the same ancient software and arriving at the same conclusion. That crate contains something that eats things. Velthara looked at the containment rating stenciled on the side in 7 languages. Tier 7 live specimen, KethAL, full restraint active. She had studied the KethAL extensively, documented apex predator, 40 to 60 kilograms of optimized biology, 6 confirmed kill methods, and a prey list that included 3 species currently represented in this classroom. She had studied them from text and from video and from preserved specimens in the biology department's archive. She had never been in the same room as a live one. She noted that her hands were now flat against her desk with a force she had not consciously applied. She noted that this was a species' secondary threat response. Press against a surface, reduce your visible profile, wait. She noted that she was doing it automatically. She also noted that Marcus Hale had not moved at all. He was still in the back row, weight forward on his elbows, reading something on his datapad, the same easy posture he had held for the entire lecture, and he had not shifted 1 centimeter in response to the crate's arrival, which meant either that he had not noticed it or that he had noticed it and decided it was not relevant, and she did not know which of those options was more alarming. Professor Daxai began explaining the behavioral mechanics of a KethAL in a controlled environment, the difference between exploratory movement and pre-strike positioning, the way the forward limbs loaded weight before an attack, the specific sound the creature made when it was genuinely interested in something as opposed to performing interest for territorial reasons. It was good information. Velthara was recording all of it. She was also watching Marcus. He had put down his datapad. He was watching the crate. Not the way the rest of the class was watching it, with the full body alertness of prey in an open field, but with the same slow, complete attention he had turned on the classroom during orientation week, the kind that was not dramatic, that did not announce itself, that simply arrived and stayed. The Kethel moved inside the crate. She could hear it, the 4-beat pace of something large enough to require the whole floor of the container, and the sound made 6 students flinch visibly. Marcus's head tilted about 3 degrees to the left. He was listening to the pace. She realized this and then spent a moment examining the fact that she had realized it, that she had watched him for long enough and carefully enough that she could read that smaller signal in that specific posture, and she found the realization mildly troubling. Marcus stood up. It was not a dramatic movement. He simply unfolded. From his chair, the way people stand when they have made a straightforward decision about something, and he walked toward the front of the room. "Hail," Professor Daxai said, sharp, the automatic authority of someone who does not expect to need to repeat himself. "Sit down." Marcus did not sit down. He stopped about 2 meters from the crate and looked at it and said, "It's pacing in a 4 count. I am aware of." 4 count is distress, Marcus said, not threat posture. Threat posture is a 2 count, weight forward, short. This is a 4 count. It's moving because it's uncomfortable, not because it's calculating anything. The room was completely quiet. Not the polite quiet of students paying attention. The breathless, structural quiet of 30 organisms that had all independently decided not to make any sound that might redirect anything's attention toward them. Professor Daxai's lecture notes were still open on the board. He had stopped looking at them. Velthara watched the professor's secondary eyes, the small pair, lower on the face, the involuntary pair that her own biology professor had once explained could not be consciously controlled, that moved on pure instinct and stimulus, and they had oriented toward Marcus. Even the professor's involuntary eyes were tracking the human now. "The collar is rated for full Tier 7 aggression," Daxai said, and his voice had changed, not much, just slightly. The way a voice changes when the person using it is performing certainty they are no longer fully feeling. "The collar's fine," Marcus said, and he was not looking at the professor. He was still looking at the crate. "The pacing tells me it's not interested in the collar right now." He took one more step toward it. "What it's interested in," he said quietly, "is whether anyone in this room is going to do anything about the fact that it's uncomfortable." The Cathay AL went still. Not the loaded stillness of a predator preparing. A different stillness, almost tentative, the kind that asked a question. Marcus held his position. Velthara was looking at the professor's lecture notes, which had slid off the edge of the stand while everyone was watching Marcus, and were now on the floor. Nobody moved to pick them up. The Cathay made a sound, low and even and unlike anything in Velthara's 4 years of xenobiology coursework, and pressed the broad flat side of its head slowly against the crate wall closest to Marcus. The professor said nothing. The class said nothing. Marcus stood there in front of the most documented predator in the known catalogue and looked at it the way a person looks at something they recognize, not something they fear, not something they are performing bravery about, something they simply know. 4 count, he said again, mostly to himself, like he was confirming something he had already decided. Velthara looked at her data pad. She had written nothing during the last 11 minutes. She had not noticed until now. She opened a new file and wrote. The professor's involuntary eyes tracked him first. Then she sat with that sentence for a long time. The incident report filed afterward used the phrase atypical lateral torque event to describe what the Cathay AL did to the restraint collar. Velthara read the report 3 days later and thought that atypical lateral torque event was a very clean and professional way of saying the collar broke and nobody had built it assuming. The Cathay would try that particular motion because the Cathay had never tried that particular motion before, and the reason it had never tried it before was that no one had ever put a Cathay in a small container and then stood 2 meters away doing whatever Marcus Hale was doing that made the Cathay want very badly to get closer to him. But that was later. In the room, in the moment, the sequence was very fast. The sound the collar made was a single sharp crack, like dense material giving up a fight it had already lost, and then the crate door swung open, and the Cathay was in the room. 31 organisms processed this at different speeds. The Cathay processed it fastest. 0.6 of a second from door open to full room assessment, according to the sensors, and at the end of that 0.6 of a second it had already solved the geometry. Geometry was not a metaphor here. A Cathay targeting process was documented, studied, and genuinely structured like an equation. Mass of available prey, distance, exit proximity, which organism presented the smallest profile, which organism's visible threat response most resembled paralysis. Velthara's exoskeleton was the thinnest in the room. She was the correct answer to the equation. She knew this. She had known it since she first saw the containment rating on the crate, had known it the way her species always knew. These things, with the particular and exhausting clarity of 400 years of being the correct answer to a great many predators' equations. She pressed flat against her desk. Her hands went white at the joints. The Kethael moved toward her, not running. A Kethael never ran at the start because it didn't need to. A measured, deliberate approach, the forward limbs loading weight in the 2 count that Marcus had described from outside the crate, and the room around her erupted into the sound of every other organism finding a wall or a corner or each other's company. Marcus was already moving. She did not see him start, she only saw him arrive, and he arrived between her and there. Kethael, and he did not look like someone who had made a dramatic decision. He looked like someone who had stepped around a puddle. One smooth sidestep from where he had been standing, already at the front near the crate, and then he was simply there, between the Kethael and Velthara, his back to her, his weight distributed across both feet, and he was not in a combat stance, he was not in any stance she had a word for, he was just standing in the particular way that he stood, and he looked at the Kethael. He made eye contact with it. This was documented later as the thing that defied existing behavioral models most completely. Not that he moved, not that he stayed calm, but that he made deliberate, sustained eye contact with a Tier 7 predator at a distance of approximately 1 meter, and the Kethael stopped. The Kethael stopped. It was mid-stride when it stopped, one forward limb lifted and not yet placed, and it held that position for 2 full seconds, which is a very long time when you are watching it happen, and then it set the limb down slowly, and it looked at Marcus, and it did not look away. The room had gone so quiet that Velthara could hear the station's ventilation system, which she had never noticed before in 4 years of being in this building. Professor Daxai was near the far wall. He had a containment device in his hands, the emergency unit, mounted near the door, and he was not using it, and Velthara understood why. Using it would require getting closer, and getting closer would require moving, and moving would introduce a variable into whatever was currently happening between Marcus and the Kethael that nobody in the room fully understood well enough to risk disrupting. Marcus did not move. His hands were at his sides. She could see his hands from where she was pressed against the desk, those blunt flat nails she had catalogued 6 times in her datapad, the vestigial keratin with no functional edge, and they were open, not raised, not positioned for anything, just open and relaxed and down. The Kethael's head moved, a slow, deliberate shift, and its primary sensory organs were fully oriented on Marcus, processing him, running whatever internal classification system it had built over its documented lifespan of 847 kills across 6 species. She knew that number. She had memorized it from the course files. 847 confirmed kills. The Kethael was looking at the 848th candidate for that list. The Kethael made a sound. Low, chest level, felt more than heard. A sound that moved through the floor and through her desk and through her hands that were still pressed flat against it. And the sound was not a threat sound. It was not the pre-strike vocalization in the behavioral index. It was not anything in the behavioral index. It was a sound her species had no file for. Marcus said, very quietly, yeah. One word. The weight of a door closing. Then, I know. The Kethael held his gaze for another long moment, and then, with the singular unhurried dignity of something that has made a decision entirely on its own terms, it sat down. It just sat down on the classroom floor, in the open space near the front, the way a large animal sits when it has decided that whatever it was doing a moment ago is no longer what it wants to be doing. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Marcus let out a slow breath, not shaking, not relief exactly, something smaller and more mechanical, the exhale of a person who has been holding a very specific kind of internal balance and has now allowed it to relax 1 degree. He turned back toward his row. He looked at Velthara as he passed her desk, 1 second, direct, no decoration, and he said nothing and she said nothing, and he went back to his seat at the back and sat down. She heard him pick up his data pad. She heard him resume whatever he had been reading before the crate door opened. She was still flat against her desk. She could not yet determine when she would stop being flat against her desk. The Kethael sat on the classroom floor and looked at the back row. Velthara looked at her datapad, where classification pending still sat open in the corner of her screen. She did not update the file. She did not have the category to update it to. The debrief room was on the administrative level of the station, 3 floors above the biology wing, and it smelled like recycled air and institutional anxiety. Velthara had been asked to attend as a witness. Technically, she was the organism the Kethael had been approaching when the incident reached its critical point, which made her a primary source in the safety review, and she had said yes because she was meticulous about paperwork and because saying no would have required explaining that she needed to spend some time sitting quietly in her room reorganizing her threat assessment index from the ground up. There were 7 people in the debrief room. 4 Academy safety officials, Druthri, the senior one, who ran these reviews, plus 3 assistants whose job appeared to be writing things down at whatever speed Druthri produced them. Professor Daxai, who had the particular expression of someone who had arrived expecting to defend their professional judgment and was not confident the defense would hold. 1 medical monitor from the Student Health Division, there to confirm that no one had been physically injured, which was technically true if you defined injured in a way that did not include a significant number of things. And Marcus Hale, who was sitting in the chair on the left side of the table with his hands flat in front of him and the expression of someone waiting for a transport connection. Not bored. Marcus never read as bored, just present in the room the way objects are present in a room, without any particular interest in performing anything for anyone's benefit. Druthri opened the file on his display and began reading the standard incident preamble: containment failure, uncontrolled specimen exposure, assessment of risk to enrolled students, and while he read it, Velthara watched Marcus's hands. Flat on the table. All 7 species in the room had hands or hand-equivalent appendages. And if she ranked them right now by stillness, Marcus was first by a margin that was not subtle. The Druthri species was second, and they were a prey-adjacent species whose primary evolutionary strategy had been freezing, so the bar for stillness that Marcus had cleared was not a small one. Druthri turned to the Earth data. An assistant pulled it up on the shared display, the planetary metrics that the Academy kept on file for every homeworld in the contact registry, and the room looked at the numbers, and the numbers were the kind of numbers that produced a specific kind of silence. Atmospheric oxygen, 21%, rich, volatile, capable of sustaining combustion at almost any ignition. Point. Gravitational baseline, 1G, enough to produce skeletal density in native organisms that would read as abnormal under most station medical scanners. Macrofauna threat index to thresher baseline physiology, 73% classified lethal within 4 minutes of contact. Velthara was threshy. She looked at 73% for a long moment. Druthri read it aloud, carefully, the way officials read numbers they want on the record, and then he looked at Marcus and said, "Does this data match your understanding of your homeworld's biosphere?" Marcus glanced at the display. "It's the old data," he said. A very short pause. Post-climate shifted closer to 81. The room processed this differently depending on species. The Druthri assistants, who had been writing things down at a steady pace, all stopped writing at the same moment, which was something Velthara noticed because the sound of writing stopping was the loudest thing in the room for a moment. Professor Daxo looked at the wall. The medical monitor looked at Marcus with the expression of someone revising a document in real time. Marcus was not looking at any of them. He was looking at the display with the mild corrective attention of someone who has found a typo in a menu. A small error, worth mentioning, not worth making a significant event of. 81%, Druthri said, not as a question exactly, more as an act of making it real by saying it out loud. Give or take, Marcus said. Some of it depends on season and whether you're counting marine environments separately, because marine is technically a different set, but land-based, thresher baseline, for minute window, yeah, 81 is closer. He said this the way weather is described. The way conditions are stated to someone who asked and will find the information useful. Velthara was looking at his hands. She had been looking at his hands for the entire debrief and she could not stop, and she understood that this had become a fixation, that her nervous system had attached to his hands as the primary reference point because they were the most confusing data in the room, because nothing about them explained the rest of the data, because they were flat and blunt and made of the same soft keratin she had catalogued 6 times in her file as vestigial and functionally useless. 81% lethal. To her species. On his planet. And he had chosen to leave. Druthri moved forward in the review. The collar failure mechanics, the response sequence, the question of whether safety protocols needed revision, and all of this was covered carefully, and all of it was relevant, and none of it was the question Velthara needed answered, which was not a question she had been asked to attend the debrief to answer. Near the end, one of the junior assistants asked, without looking up from her notes, "Can you describe your emotional state during the incident, specifically at the point of direct contact with the specimen?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. Not an evasive quiet, a genuine one, the quiet of someone actually consulting their internal record rather than deciding how to present it. "Not afraid of it, if that's what you mean," he said. He thought about it a moment more. "Mostly I was thinking about the collar," he said. "Single-point locking mechanism on a Tier 7 containment unit is a design problem. I would have used 2 redundant points, offset, whoever certified that rating should probably hear about it. Before the next demonstration. He said this with the same flat, practical tone he used for everything. The junior assistant had been writing steadily since the start of the review. She wrote what he said. She stopped. She looked at what she had written. She did not add anything to it. Valthara looked at her own datapad, open on the table in front of her, where she had been recording the debrief for her witness statement. At the bottom of the document, below all the factual entries, below the timestamps and the direct quotes and the carefully formatted notes, she had written one line that was not part of the witness statement and that she would delete before filing it. She had written, he corrected the number. She had written, he was not bragging when he corrected the number. She had written, I do not know a word for what he was doing when he corrected the number. She looked at Marcus's hands, flat on the table, forgotten there by their owner, not performing anything, not arranged to communicate anything, simply placed and left. She added one more line. She wrote, the hands do not explain the rest of him. Then she saved the file and decided she would delete that part later and then did not delete it. She found him in the East Courtyard 2 hours after the debrief ended. This was not an accident. She had checked the Academy's common area schedule and cross-referenced it with the meal period rotation for first-year students, which gave her a reasonable probability window, and she had then walked to the East Courtyard at the beginning of that window, which was the kind of thing she would have described to anyone who asked as simply following the logical sequence of available information, and which she understood privately was something else. He was sitting on the low wall that ran along the observation deck railing, facing the station's exterior port, the big one, where transport ships came and went in the slow mechanical ballet of docking procedures, and he had a meal packet in one hand, open, eating from it in the unhurried way of someone who had nowhere specific to be and had made a kind of temporary peace with that. She had prepared a statement. 14 sentences. 3 formal gratitude constructions in the academic register her species used for addressing someone who had performed a significant action on their behalf. Not personal, not warm, careful and measured and correct. 2 reciprocal offers, 1 acknowledgement of the incident's unusual circumstances, and a closing statement that she felt covered the essential ground without requiring either of them to remain in the conversation longer than necessary. She walked up to him. She opened her mouth. She said, I wanted to. And then she produced no further words. Marcus looked at her. He looked at her the same way he looked at everything, fully, without urgency, with the complete and simple attention of someone who has nowhere else to be, and then he reached into the bag next to him on the wall and held out half the meal packet without saying anything. She took it. She did not have a prepared response for this. She sat on the wall next to him, at a reasonable distance, and they both looked at the observation port, where a Class 4 transport was running through its pre-departure sequence, the docking arms releasing in order, each lock disengaging with a small flash of pressurized air. They sat there for a while without talking. This was not uncomfortable. She noted that it was not uncomfortable, because it was the kind of thing she would have expected to be uncomfortable, and she wanted to be accurate in her internal record. Eventually she looked at him and said, more carefully than her 14 prepared sentences, more carefully than anything she had said in the debrief, why did you step in front of it? Marcus chewed, thoughtful. Closest one to it, he said. He said it the way you state a direction. North is north, the door is left, the closest one was me. That is not, she started, and then stopped, because she was not sure how to finish the sentence in a way that captured what she meant, which was, that is not a sufficient explanation. For the action, that is not the kind of accounting that the action requires, that you cannot reduce what you did to a simple matter of spatial proximity and expect that to satisfy the question. He looked at the transport. Had a dog, he said, easy, conversational, like a thing he is describing to fill a comfortable silence. Back home, shepherd mix, big one, about 35 kilos, dumb as a bag of rocks in the best way, would try to eat literally anything she could get her mouth on. Veltara waited. The Kethael reminded me of her, he said. When she wanted something and couldn't work out how to ask, same energy, that same kind of frustrated, uncomfortable, he tilted his head. Slightly, reaching for the word, working itself up to something energy. He took another bite. Same 4-count pace, he said, just bigger. Velthara looked at her meal packet. She was not eating it. She was holding it and looking at the label, which said mild flavor in 6 languages, and she was having a very specific and difficult to describe experience with the words mild flavor, which was that they had become, in this moment, the most loaded 2 words she had encountered in 4 years of academic study. He had picked mild. This man, who had grown up on a planet where 81% of large animal life was lethal to her species within 4 minutes of contact, who had stood in front of a Tier 7 predator with 847 confirmed kills and held eye contact with it and said, "Yeah, I know," in the tone of someone recognizing a familiar face. This man had stood in a food service line at some point today and looked at the options and chosen mild flavor. She opened her data pad. She did not know why she opened her data pad. Habit, probably. The same reflex that had made her catalog his fingernails 6 times in the first week. The same reflex that had made her record the professor's involuntary eyes. The same reflex that sent her to the East Courtyard with 14 prepared sentences when what she had actually needed was to sit on a wall and be handed half a meal. Packet. She pulled up the Cathay AL's official Academy file. It loaded the incident record first, standard format, chronological, and the kill count was at the top in the summary header, the way important information is always placed at the top in a summary header. 847 confirmed kills across 6 species, 3 escape containment events, 0 documented instances of voluntary disengagement following active pursuit. 0. She looked at that number. She looked at Marcus. He was watching the transport ship complete its departure sequence, both docking arms fully retracted now, the ship beginning the slow rotation that would align it with the outbound lane, and he simply looked. Like a person watching a thing that is happening, with no commentary prepared, no performance of any feeling about it. She closed the file. She looked at the meal packet in her hands, mild flavor, and something happened in her chest that was the closest she had a name for to what her species called Velshri, which was the old word, the pre-contact word, the word from the centuries of hiding in crevices and listening for the sounds of the things that wanted to eat them, and which translated imprecisely as, the relief of being on the correct side of something. She had not felt Velshri in a very long time. She had not expected to feel it in an academy courtyard being handed half a meal. Packet by a human who thought the Cathay AL reminded him of his dog. Marcus crumpled the empty packet. "Same time tomorrow, if you want," he said, not looking at her, already half-turned toward whatever he was going to do next, already in the process of standing. And it was not a question, not an invitation exactly, just a statement of available logistics, the same practical flatness he applied to everything. He stood. He walked away from the wall. He did not look back. She sat with the half-eaten meal packet in her hands and watched him go. This unremarkable-looking creature with the blunt, flat fingernails and the mild flavor preference and the voice like packed gravel who had been shaped by a world that produced things with far sharper edges than him and had somehow, through whatever combination of biology and experience and the particular confidence of something that has never seriously been questioned, become the sharpest thing in the room without appearing to notice. She opened her witness report. The official document, the one that would go to Druthy's office, the one that was careful and factual and contained everything a safety review required. At the bottom, below the last entry, below the timestamps and the collar specifications and the behavioral sequence she had recorded as accurately as she knew how, she added 2 lines that were not for the safety review. She wrote, "He does not know what he is." She sat with that for a long moment. Then she wrote, "I do not know if that makes it more or less frightening." She saved the file. She looked at the observation port, where the transport had completed its rotation and was moving into the outbound lane, growing smaller against the dark in the steady, unhurried way of something that has a long way to go and already knows it will get there. She looked at the meal packet. Mild flavor. She finished it.